Yeah, it seems like there's a weird correlation between like UFO conspiracy theories and like right-leaning tendencies for some reason.
Yeah, you know, I really like the X-Files, and I always kind of assumed that Mulder was kind of left-leaning, but then in the newer episodes, he gets into the FEMA camps and all that kind of stuff.
Oh dear.
And then I watched them again, and you know, it's not really clear actually. You know, a lot of the stuff kind of leans right too. Just kind of me interpreting it as, you know, kind of sympathetic to my views, right? Empathize with the main character.
And maybe that's, you know, maybe they purposely leave that up to interpretation. Like, I was thinking about this the other day, like Star Trek The Next Generation. I have no cohesive thought on this, and I'm certainly far from like an art critic or whatever, but like the idea of it is actually pretty cool that, like, you know, there's a post-scarcity world, and all we do now is we use our what was previously military force to defend ourselves to just literally just go exploring as an end instead of a means to an end.
Yeah, actually, there's a nice book that actually I haven't read yet, but by Manu Sadia, who's on Twitter a lot, all about that, the kind of economics of Star Trek and, you know, what kind of a post-scarcity world would look like. I mean, it's kind of like a, what do they call that? Fully automated luxury space communism. I mean, that's kind of what Star Trek is supposed to be about, in a sense.
Here's to hoping.
Yes.
Here's to hoping.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, also, I think the X-Files, you know, in the 90s, you kind of have the transition between the Cold War and kind of post 9/11 fears. And so then everybody, you know, kind of doesn't have this, they kind of worry that, you know, the government's up to something, even though they don't have this kind of these conspiracies about communism or the Cold War, things like that. And so I think people kind of projected that in the 90s onto these alien conspiracies, that the government's still up to something, that they don't have these Cold War objectives, so they must be doing something else nefarious.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was actually texting with my cousin this morning, and we were just talking about this guy that's apparently she was saying, hey, you're gonna watch this Dr. Rick Bright testimony, and I was like, I didn't even realize that there was some sort of testimony going on, and I started kind of thinking about it because I could feel myself becoming cynical as I was even thinking about it. I was like, why would I care about this? And then I kind of looked into it, and it's like, oh, well, he's a vaccine guy and he worked for Health and Human Services and whatnot. And I was like, theoretically, like a testimony in front of Congress should be somebody who has maybe been part of something that did something wrong or witnessed something that was going on wrong and is facing the people. But I feel so like cynical about it because I'm like, well, why should we expect for there to be any accountability? Because most of the interests aren't left with the people. It's really just that the congressmen are so moneyed from their donors that are part of private interests that it's not facing people. It's probably facing the same revolving door of industry to government that the person has come out of that is even testifying.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there was a big deal about this kind of new world order that, you know, now that communism was gone, you just have a kind of global elite that's just, you know, working together to kind of keep people down. Now they're not fighting with each other. Now all the top kind of elites across the world are all in a conspiracy to keep people down, basically. But, you know, after 9/11, then, you know, the zeitgeist really changes, and that really kills the show's ratings, actually. If you look at the X-Files, that's when it basically dies, because nobody cares about aliens anymore.
Really?
Yeah, it's funny looking back at the viewership, too, because that's kind of when cable is still ramping up. So they could get, like, 22 million viewers and have, like, 20 to 30 episodes a season.
It's so wild.
And now, you know, if you got that, you would just be, you know, fantastically rich, right? I mean, nobody can do those numbers anymore.
No. It's funny, too. Like, I just, something popped into my mind, which was like a little clip from I think it was from 2005, the movie with Tom Cruise, War of the Worlds. And the little girl, when they're his daughter, whatever, and they're driving away from the first wave of attacks or whatever, and she goes, "Is it the terrorists?"
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, I mean, you switch to like the kind of Spider-Man superhero movie thing where Spider-Man just does huge numbers when they weren't really any superhero movies in the 90s that were big. And so then, you know, everybody kind of wants these kind of childlike protectors, right? You go into kind of child mode and you need the daddy to protect you.
It's weird.
Yeah.
I thought about this like almost as like a leading indicator, and I remember hearing this. I didn't independently verify it, but it was like in the year 2014, out of the top 10 grossing movies, only one was an original screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember which. It was like Interstellar or something. I don't remember which one it was.
Yeah.
But I remember learning that, and it was probably like, at the end of the year, maybe it was the early part of 2015 when I heard that, and I thought, we're headed for something a bit weird, because like we're looking back and kind of coddling ourselves in nostalgia instead of kind of looking forward and creating something new. And I think we see that now too. I was recording last night with Gregory Harden on his Green Corn Rebellion show. We were talking about that, like how kids, like the vaporwave movement, like vaporwave music, where it's this kind of like early 90s, late 80s mall music that you would hear. It's so bizarre. Like these kids that are into it, like, kids even younger than Zoomers or whatever, like never grew up near anything that remotely resembled that. Yep. And yet they're kind of caught up in that nostalgia for a thing that they hadn't even experienced, which isn't new, right? Like people, like, I love the Beatles.
Yep.
John Lennon died, I think, before I was born. What's the difference?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, again, going back to the 90s, I mean, there you had real optimism. I think that's part of it, is kind of this nostalgia of going back. I mean, back then, the conservatives really wanted to go back because they didn't like the societal changes. But most people were kind of happy. The U.S. was the uncontested superpower. The economy was booming. The U.S. was doing better than Europe and Japan. And so, then the kind of economic concerns too were, by the early 2000s, you had, this fear that like China would sell all of the U.S. bonds. That was the kind of main concern. So most economists weren't really thinking about this financial crisis. It was, everything was supposed to be solved. We were in this period of kind of perpetual prosperity. And so then I think the period from kind of 2007 or 2006 to now is kind of the breaking of that, where you get a lot of precarity and there's a lot more pessimism about the future.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah.
That sounds right to me.
Now when I was a young boy, about the age of 5, my teachers taught me I could be the greatest man alive. They told me I could change the world, be whatever I wanted to be. There was no one in the world like me. Every one of us was so unique. I'd not be an average man. No, sir, I'd be no average man. So I have those big dreams.
Welcome back, everybody, to Eat the Rich. This is a show about our political economy, late-stage capitalism, and the millionaires, billionaires, and multinational corporations hell-bent on staving off its death rattle. I'm Dwight, and today we are very pleased to be joined by an assistant professor at American University in Washington, D.C., with a focus in macroeconomics and economic history and an expertise in the Great Depression, Dr. Gabe Mathy.
Hello. Happy to be here.
It's honestly a thrill. I think, I've been kind of trying to plot along with some of my low-rent economics expertise, which is very thin, high breadth, low depth. And to have you on, it's a pleasure. Obviously, we've been talking on Twitter for a little while now, getting to know each other. So it's a thrill to have you on. I think one of the reasons it's so prescient to have you on, like in this moment and like almost literally this week, is job loss numbers, unemployment numbers were refreshed this morning, including last week's numbers. We're looking at 36.5 million unemployed in America as a result of in the last few months anyway. And so I think what's helpful for the listener, and especially you coming on, is to ask a question on behalf of the listener, which is, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, so, this is an unprecedented crisis, I think. So, I'm not going to say that it's definitely going to be as bad as the Great Depression. There's still potential for the government to respond in a sufficient way, though I'm not that optimistic. I think after the CARES Act, that's probably the last kind of big package, though we can talk about that more later. But definitely the size of the negative shock is unprecedented, I think, in terms of the speed of the job losses. Even in the Great Depression, now the labor force is about a third as large, so the population is about a third as large, but you only got a couple million net new unemployed in a year. So it's kind of a slow moving process where you have some shocks at the beginning. You have the Fed kind of tightens a little bit. There's the stock market crash, but overall, compared to what we're seeing now, it's really nothing. And it's just this kind of slow-moving unraveling that takes place over several years. So from 29 to 33, things gradually get worse. Whereas here, we're doing 2 years of a Great Depression unemployment in 2 months, basically. So things are just moving much, much more rapidly. By 1930, we only had unemployment of around 10%, and so we're already past that in just a couple months.
So I want to draw some comparisons with 1929, early 1930s. But before we did, this morning, just out of curiosity, I was looking up the unemployment numbers in comparison to the 2008 financial crisis.
Yes.
And since I would imagine that most of our listeners are like millennials and Zoomers, this is very fresh in their minds. And what was stark to me, I'm trying not to swear too early. What stark to me was what the unemployment numbers looked like in comparison with 2008 and 2009. It was very gradual and only reached a peak of 10% by October of 2009. So it was going up, like September of 2008 was 6.1%, gradually went up 9% in April, and then finally hit in October 2009, 10%.
Yep.
As a comparison, in 2020, the March unemployment numbers were 4.4%, and the April unemployment numbers were 14.7%. And then who the hell knows what it's going to be for... I mean, do you happen to know what it's on track to be for what it's going to look like right now for May?
I mean, it's really hard to forecast. There's different ways to kind of estimate it. So the initial claims are going to be how many new people are filing for new claims every week, and then you can look at the continuing claims. So the continuing claims are at about 22 million. The thing is that this is so unprecedented that the distinction between which labor market category you're in is going to be a bit tricky, especially because it's surveys. So, it's ultimately people are asking, are you unemployed? Are you looking for work? Or are you furloughed? And so, the definition of a furlough is that unemployed or not. Some of the enumerators are messing that up just because, it's not totally clear exactly what categories they should be. So, it might be better to think about, say, job losses versus the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate may be a little bit funny for these days, because you have things like people filing for unemployment if they're gig workers, like Uber workers, even though they wouldn't formally be unemployed because they're still working some of the time, though they've lost most of their income. So a lot of this is becoming a kind of gray area, but it's not unreasonable to think that we might have, say, 20 or 25%. But just given the data issues, it's just hard to forecast. Though the continuing claims slowed down a little bit, so they're still rising, even though we're supposed to have this rapid recovery from the reopenings. Plus that the PPP kind of requires businesses to rehire people. So, there's also that issue that the PPP is package requires that for the loans that the government gives to businesses to be forgiven, they have to rehire most of their workers. So then, we may get a kind of second wave of unemployment, not of the disease, where once the requirement that you rehire the workers expires, I think it's in the fall, then we may get a second wave. So it's just hard to tell given all these kind of moving parts. It's really hard to forecast. But in terms of the kind of true unemployment rate, I think that 20 to 25% in the summer I think is reasonable.
Yikes. So let's put a little historical comparison. I mean, most of us that have at least have a few generations in America have stories about the Depression and what it was like. I mean, how do those unemployment numbers or job loss numbers compare to how bad it was during the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s?
So there, the US got to about 25% unemployment. It was one of the worst countries in the world. Germany got to about 30%. We all know what happened there. The path from 1933 was very different. But other countries got to say, like around 20% for the UK. I think France was a little bit lower. So they may surpass their Great Depression numbers because the Great Depression is the U.S. is really central to that story in 1929. So the thing is, we do have a better safety net than before, and the CARES Act, parts of the left were able to push through these very generous benefits. So the goal was to get 100% wage replacement. Because the U.S. system is just so archaic and it's based on states, they couldn't really do that. So they don't even have the kind of computer capacity to just replace 100% of wages. So then they had the $600 a week payment instead. Though to some extent, this problem where the government's so incompetent, it meant that some people are getting more than 100% of their wages replaced. For the first time in world history, the U.S. is the most generous unemployment insurance system in the world, because the U.S. was kind of behind Britain and Germany, and we only got unemployment insurance in the 30s. In the Great Depression, you had some state systems, but you didn't really have this. You had some state relief, but you didn't even have state unemployment systems till the 30s. I think Wisconsin is the first in 35, I believe, just 1 year before you get the federal system. So during all that time, you have basically no unemployment insurance. You have some state relief programs where basically you'll either have, if you're able-bodied, usually kind of male breadwinner, you'll get some kind of work relief. So that becomes the kind of WPA programs. And then if you're, a child or the elderly or disabled, then you'll get some unconditional relief where you'll get just a payment that isn't tied to work. So they had some relief programs, but it's much less important than today, where there have been big progress made on those issues. So the U.S. had a fairly stingy unemployment insurance system relative to Western Europe, but these days actually there are some silver linings in that the CARE Act has provided these very generous unemployment benefits recently. So that's a big difference. There has been progress. I'd like to have more, but it's not as bad as 1929. I don't think anyone's going to starve, but we see the long lines at the food banks, and there's real suffering out there.
I was just curious. There was something there that you said that stuck out in my mind, which was about Wisconsin being one of the first, to have that kind of relief. Is there any historical context that would make Wisconsin stand out for some reason?
Well, they have a long history of kind of left-wing politics. Ironically, or kind of unfortunately, that's going away these days. But for a long time, the kind of upper Midwest had this tradition, usually from Germany or Scandinavia, of kind of more progressive politics. So the sewer socialists in Milwaukee, they actually had socialist mayors in Milwaukee. It's something you might be interested in reading up on, perhaps. It's an interesting episode. But
one of my favorite clips is from Wayne's World, which is where Alice Cooper explains that Milwaukee had socialist mayors.
I think one of the most interesting aspects of Milwaukee is the fact that it's the only major American city to have ever elected 3 socialist mayors.
Does this guy know how to party or what?
Okay, nice. Forgot that part of it.
It's good for a little context.
Yeah.
Please continue.
That's good. I like that. Yeah. So Wisconsin has this long history. I grew up in central Illinois, so the lower Midwest is definitely much more conservative. So you would see that the University of Wisconsin, even though it had a much smaller population, and same with the University of Minnesota, the population is much smaller than Illinois, but they had a lot more support for their public universities relatively, so that they were kind of similarly ranked or higher in some programs. So this kind of upper Midwestern progressivism has a kind of longer history. So Minnesota is still a blue state, but I think it's kind of fading this effect. The Midwest is kind of trending red, I think.
Yeah. So I'm so curious, because it seems to me that tell us a little bit about the spending that the government is doing, the $3 trillion of stimulus spending that they're trying to, what I perceive to be, is mostly go into the hands of corporations. But how is that? Seems to be a lot of money that they're printing coming from a government that has been touting, quote, fiscal responsibility and lack of printing of money. And the conservatives and moderate liberals for the entirety of my life has been saying that, spending is bad for the deficit. Not only that, but they've been saying that the national debt is one of the largest national security threats.
Yep.
How the hell does that jive?
Yeah, so that gets back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, that in the 2000s, the main concern of economists was, or the kind of crisis that everyone was worried about, the next shoe that was going to drop was this crisis that China would sell all the U.S. debt, and then there'd be some kind of financial disruption. And, we always kind of go back to that. For me too, I really disliked George Bush, and, I took the kind of Democratic line that, Clinton had run a deficit and Bush was irresponsibly doing these tax cuts. Ultimately, and then it was followed by Obama doing, this kind of same thing, that he had this initial package and then he switched to deficit reduction, and you just continually saw that the Republicans were were generally in bad faith about the deficit, right? They were never really willing to meet them halfway. And in fact, that kind of saved things that, Obama was willing to give away the store for very small GOP concessions, and they weren't willing to raise taxes at all. So, I think that that continues, that the deficit continues to be used in bad faith way by the GOP because, Trump has ballooned the deficit again. And now we're going to see that as the Democrats seem to pose to do well in November, that we're going to see the deficit concerns come back again.
Is it a concern?
Yeah. So, again, my own kind of personal evolution. I went to college in the 2000s, and so I saw these concerns about the debt, and then the debt just continues to rise, and there's kind of no problem. So, ultimately, the thing really is, there's one thing is one metric that economists use is the debt to GDP ratio. So if you think about your tax base being the kind of size of the economy, how much national income, if you take a constant share of that, as long as the national income's rising, then you can continue to pay the debt even if the debt is also rising because your ability to pay also rises. And so that's one piece of the puzzle that if you don't have growth like in Greece, if your economy's shrinking, then your ability to pay shrinks, and so this austerity can be self-defeating. But also there's the interest rate, and interest rates are at historic lows. So if you look at the 10-year bond, you get about 0.6 or 0.7%. So it's less than inflation, kind of reasonable inflation rate that we might expect over the next 10 years. So ultimately you're getting a negative return in real terms, that the amount of goods you can buy is lower. So you're lending the government money and getting less than you started with in real terms. So it doesn't seem that there's really any concern about the debt. And so it's kind of a virtuous cycle. Once interest rates are low, then the concerns about the default on the debt are low, and so then interest rates stay low. So you kind of have these virtuous cycles, or you can get vicious cycles like in Greece where they don't control their own monetary policy. So then the Fed, they don't have a central bank that can print money to help them out, help out the fiscal situation. So then it can balloon, because then since you don't have this ability to print money to pay off the debt, then it's more likely you'll default. So then the interest rates rise, and then you do default. So the U.S. is kind of on the virtuous side of that since we have a central bank, there's less concern about that because the Fed could always print money to pay off the deficit. And so then you don't worry about them not paying it.
The difference with Greece is that they use the euro, so they have the European Central Bank.
Yes, so the central bank is in Germany. They don't control that.
That's wild.
Yeah, so that helps the U.S. And so the interest rates are much lower. So if the interest rates are a third of what they were in, say, the year 2000, then your estimate of how much debt the U.S. can sustainably pay should triple. But you don't see anybody adjusting for that, right? So everybody just looks at the amount of debt, but ultimately it's how much you have to pay, because you can roll over the debt, right? So most debt just gets rolled over, and your ability to pay grows as the economy grows. And so then you really never on net pay off the debt. You just kind of roll it over. When the 10-year bond, 10 years later, you just reissue a new one, and so on. And so that's how governments usually do it, is they just tend to grow. It's fairly rare to have surpluses like we had in the late 90s. Usually countries just grow a bit faster than their debt, and so then it's sustainable that way. So I don't think that that's the primary concern, and I think that a lot of this is there's kind of two sources. One is the kind of economics mainstream that's always concerned about the debt, that usually thinks that you have to pay off the debt, even though that almost never happens.
For them being so concerned about it seems like they would do something about it.
Yes. I mean, that's what's funny about this view on, say, Social Security. So they say we have to save Social Security so that we can keep paying benefits. And how do we save it? Well, we got to cut benefits. So, that's not really saving it. So, some people will say, well, we could, do some tax increases. But ultimately, anything like, using a different price index so that benefits grow more slowly is still a benefit cut. So ultimately, with Social Security, the deficits are not that large. They're something like 1% of GDP. And so, we could either issue more debt. 1% of GDP is not huge, or cut elsewhere, raise taxes. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. So ultimately, I think that Social Security legally is only supposed to pay out of the revenues from the Social Security system, but you could just change the law and make it a regular government program that you can run deficits, and then the problem will grow slowly. But ultimately, it's just one piece of the puzzle where the tax cuts from Bush to Trump have done more damage to the budget than Social Security has.
if one of the clips from an interview with Ben Bernanke, I think, that really just like was a kind of a radicalizing moment, perhaps we can insert it here, is when Ben Bernanke was explaining how, I think it was like for the TARP program or something like that, I don't remember exactly what it was, where he just was interviewed and said, you know, it was asked, how do you physically go about spending this money or increasing this amount of money? Do you literally have to mint dollars and bills and stuff like that, currency? And he was like, well, we just kind of go into the computer and change the number from the one to the other number.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
You've been printing money.
Well, effectively, and we need to do that because our economy is very weak and inflation is very low. When the economy begins to recover, that'll be the time that we need to unwind those programs, raise interest rates, reduce the money supply, and make sure that we have a recovery that does not involve inflation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the Fed creates bank reserves. So, you know, when they create new money, they just have the right to credit ones and zeros in their account. So they buy a bond from JP Morgan, they just credit their account with new ones and zeros. I mean, ultimately, then you get into the real nitty gritty of, you know, the government, you know, the state has the right to set the unit of account, you know, what money do you count in, and, you know, they have the right to counterfeit basically, and you don't. And so that's fine. You know, we accept that as legitimate. You know, I don't have a problem with that. But yeah, ultimately that's what's going on, is that they can just create new money.
You know, I've noticed this kind of in the last 2 months as we've seen all this spending going on by the government, and people have been kind of just saying money isn't real. And the more I kind of learn about this, the more I kind of realize it's true. It really is. I think it was like John Locke that said like currency is a tacit agreement amongst men or something like that, something to that effect. It was just like this shit is just as much of a guarantee as we can say, and ultimately it comes down to the political will to do whatever we want. And so they've been printing money to pay for these social programs, or these corporate programs, mostly over the last 2 months or so, and it doesn't seem to be doing the bad thing that they said was going to happen, which is inflation. What's going on with inflation?
Yeah, so, you know, I think in terms of inflation, nobody really knows what's going on. The kind of traditional view was that you have this Phillips curve relationship where the economy is weak, companies tend to raise their prices more slowly, or they even cut prices. And if the economy is strong and, you know, unemployment's low, then you should see prices start to rise more quickly. But what we saw in the 2010s was that we had very high unemployment in the wake of the Great Recession. You know, you did have prices fall in 2009 itself, but then unemployment was pretty high. Economic growth was pretty slow. And then we still had inflation of about 1% to 2%. And then as, you know, the recovery took hold and we went from about 10% unemployment to under 4%, we still got 1% to 2% inflation. So, you know, it's kind of hard to explain. The best guess is just assume it'll be 1% to 2% like last year. So we may get some return to the Phillips curve. Now we saw that inflation is way down this month.
Yes.
So, you know, it may be back. Maybe the shock is big enough. Maybe it's the kind of thing where you kind of tap, you know, you just gradually press the accelerator versus this, you know, you're really sharply braking. So maybe that's different somehow. But yeah, I think ultimately, you know, in terms of thinking about inflation, it's not good to just think about how much money is out there. You want to think about, you know, how much is being spent, what kind of cost structures firms are facing and companies are facing. And ultimately, it's not this kind of macro big picture thing where you're just looking at the quantity of money, but you want to think about, you know, how much is being spent based on these kind of Fed actions. So, you know, one thing that's changed since 2008 is now the Fed pays interest on reserves. So it pays an interest rate, whereas before 2008 it didn't. So you got 0%. So then when the Fed created these new bank reserves, this new money for the banks, then they would, you know, tend to use it to buy or to lend or other things because they were getting 0% otherwise. That's not how banks make money. So now they get an interest rate on that that's pretty similar to the other short-run interest rates out there that they can get for few days. And so then they have an incentive to just keep that money at the Fed. So, essentially the Fed will buy an asset from a bank like JP Morgan, and then they'll just keep their money at their deposit account at the Fed. So that's going to limit a lot how much economic effect there is. So there's some debate on, whether the interest rate on reserves should be lowered to try and stimulate more. But it does give the Fed this ability to create a lot of money, create a lot of bank reserves without having these inflationary consequences. So it does help them to kind of support the Treasury and create new money rather than creating new debt. So if if I could just finish. So if the money just stays at JP Morgan and it stays at the Fed's account, then why would we expect there to be inflation? There's no new spending. It's not going to change the costs that firms are facing. And so here we're seeing a lot of cost shocks with things like meat shortages and egg shortages. So we're seeing inflation there, and then other prices are falling like oil, which is traditionally kind of driver of inflation.
I wanted to get to oil, and if you could explain what a cost shock is for the listener.
Sure. So, in the 70s, the big concern was that oil prices rose. You had the 73 OPEC oil embargo, and then in the late 70s, you have disruptions related to the Iranian Revolution, so that oil prices went way up. And so then, anybody that used oil, trucking companies, manufacturers, the economy was much more reliant on energy back then. They all faced a higher cost, and so, their profits were hurt, so they were hiring less, investing less. But you also got inflation at the same time because they had to pass on some of those costs. They didn't eat all of them. So you got this painful period of stagflation where you had economic weakness with inflation. So the kind of traditional relationship is that, you have a kind of demand shock where either the economy's booming and, unemployment's low and firms are able to raise their prices faster because there's lots of consumers. The consumers are not that choosy. They're not clipping coupons if the economy's booming, so they can raise their prices more. In a bust, then you'll get the kind of traditional high unemployment, and then there's going to be a lot of sales, or firms are cutting prices to try to keep customers in the stores if the economy's weak.
Are we seeing those sorts of things now? Decrease in prices?
Well, we're seeing kind of both. In terms of oil, that cost is down. So, any kind of trucking company, they're seeing, they're kind of booming. If you're doing deliveries, if you're Amazon, right, you can deliver for cheap. Gas is cheap.
Jesus.
But then, if you're a restaurant, if you're a steak restaurant, then you're seeing higher costs because we're getting all these disruptions from meat packing plants. So we're seeing kind of both, and some people think one will win out over the other, but I think ultimately this is a big enough demand shock that will see high unemployment and lower inflation probably. And that's what we're seeing this month, at least, a big decline in inflation.
Right. So what does that mean to the American family's pocketbook? What does that mean to them if they're renters?
What does the current situation mean?
Yeah.
So the rent situation is interesting. Here again we're seeing this. We saw unemployment benefits really rising a lot, and now we're seeing a lot of people realizing that companies and households can just not pay their rent. One thing we might touch on later, but I think there's also similarities with World War I, not necessarily with the Spanish flu that followed it, but with you saw this huge crisis in World War I where you have these kind of stodgy, outdated elites, this gerontocracy that sends all these millions of people to die due to their incompetence. Yeah, and then after the war, people were tired of living like that, so all these autocracies, all these old empires get swept away. I wonder how much. I don't want to assume that this will totally change society, but we may see some openings where people realize that they don't want to live like they did before. Maybe we'll get better paid leave. People realize how cruel and unsanitary it is to not have paid sick leave.
Yep.
And so whether we'll see this also in terms of rent, whether people have more eviction moratoria and things like that. So there's one view of economists that this is kind of the economy is just in a coma, so we just need to kind of shut it down for health reasons, and so then we just need to freeze all payments. And so as long as you have this kind of musical chairs, as long as everybody keeps moving around, as long as we just stop the payments, as everybody stops their payments, then it's okay. The renters stop their payments, then the landlords stop their payments to the banks, and so on and so forth. But the thing is that nobody wants to be the bag holder. So you can try to have the government just step in and make the payments for a while, but it's really hard to coordinate that. Many people can still make their mortgage payments or their rent payments. Then how do you determine who's kind of needy or not? But I do think there's some openings here for some progress to be made when people realize how rigid some of our rules are, how cruel some evictions are and things like that. Whether we want to have a system where landlords have so much power and things like that.
It strikes me seeing the similarities of the social programs that had come about after the Great Depression. I'm a big fan of Richard Wolff, and one of the things that really struck me from listening to him and kind of understanding what had happened after the Great Depression rather, is the political will that came from political organization and grassroots organizing that allowed for this coalition of the labor movement to knock on FDR's door and say, hey, there's historical precedent for separating necks from heads. When income inequality and material conditions get so badly, if you want to avoid that, we need healthcare, retirement, unemployment benefits, jobs guarantees, and we've gotten that. And I don't know if you saw a GIF, or it was a little thing that was going around Twitter yesterday. I certainly posted about it, which was the top taxation rate post-recession over the past 100 or so years, 90 years. Yep. And what I read that as is a sustained campaign of, let's just call it the rich people, the capitalist class, the ruling class, whatever term you want to use, to say, it's going to take a while, but we're going to roll all that shit back. Yep. And it seems like they were exceedingly deft at doing that. It seems like they've gotten what they wanted, and it's culminated in them literally, having a few members of their class as being president in the last 20 years or so, Bush and Trump and whatnot. We know that social democratic programs will be eroded eventually. We now have historical precedent to see that. So what makes this different, and what should we do to ensure the permanence of those social democratic programs, or can we?
I think I'm a bit more optimistic than you are about the future. I mean,
I hope so.
I think there will be a lot of disruptions from this, and hopefully we can have some good things come out of this. But if you look at someone like Biden, I think he's likely to do well in the fall. But also, me, growing up in the 90s, I remember all those kind of conservative Democrats. Oh, yeah. And you can see that in the old clips of Biden. But I think even he, it's a combination of his ambition to be president. I think that's his main concern, and he's not as concerned with implementing the kind of conservative policies that he liked in the 90s. But also I think he sees that the winds are changing, that the left is rising, and so you see that in his kind of joint proposals with Sanders that goes beyond what Obama offered to the left. And so I think there are some. I think he kind of sees that the winds are changing, and I think that's something to think about. That you have new politicians like AOC. There was nobody like that in the 90s. God, no. Bernie Sanders doing so well. So I have hope for the younger generation now that I'm kind of entering middle age. But I think that they're generally more progressive. I think they're generally further left than previous generations, and so I'm optimistic about the young, that hopefully they can move beyond what my generation and what older generations have been able to do. So we'll see what happens in the wake of the crisis, but you can see it with support for Medicare for All, where even with Biden voters it's fairly popular, and I think ultimately Biden will sign whatever, if he becomes president, will ultimately sign whatever the Congress passes.
He has said that he would veto it if it came to his desk.
He has said that, but I think that I think that's for his donors' consumption, that he doesn't want to give in too much. I think that he'll be old, and he's not going to want to rock the boat. So hopefully the Congress can move in a leftward direction in the fall, and hopefully we can have some progress along these lines. I mean, I don't think that Medicare for All is likely to pass, but I think if there's some kind of good public option that could be a kind of transition, once people see that government insurance works, then I think we'll quickly move to something like Medicare for All, because people will see just how cruel, inhumane, and efficient the current system based on private insurance is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite clear how cruel, and if for no other reason than just a fiscal health reason, it is completely deleterious to the health of the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking about what the effect on hospitals would be, and I figured that at the very least, you get high pay for doctors in the current system.
Yep.
So at the very least, you get that in the pandemic. It's not good globally, but for this moment, it would be fine. And that the insurers would be funneling money into the healthcare system system, and this was my forecast in March that this would be good. That at least even though they're not great globally, they're going to pump a lot of money into the hospitals, and so they might need a bailout later, but at least we've got this system that will kind of pump money into the hospitals. But I was wrong. I didn't understand how the system really works, and it's all based on this kind of non-essential care. All the actual medical care that you really need makes them no money, and they're cutting doctor salaries and firing healthcare workers, and so it's just kind of unimaginable, how bad the system is, that it can't even provide in a crisis like this, where you'd think that you'd have these silver linings. Even in this kind of crisis, it's still a complete failure, and just completely failing on all dimensions.
Ironically, conglomerate health groups and the huge hospitals that have been consolidated and built since Obamacare had been facilitated in ways by Obamacare because many more people had access to get those complex surgeries that they fucking needed, and because they were able to get insurance. It didn't have all that much of a great effect on the general health of the nation, but it is, like you, I was completely baffled and just like disgusted by the way that hospitals are trying to get over this with as much immediacy as any other industry, because they're like, we can't exist without getting that insurance dollars for those complex surgeries. Even though we have completely filled beds, it's not the kind of business that allows us to sustain our overinflated bottom line. Just an amazingly morally bankrupt system. I'm dying to ask you about this particular article that I had read of yours about the first services recession.
Actually, this is a good lead-in, because part of the services decline, I still think I'm right, but actually I didn't forecast that a lot of the services decline was from healthcare. So because the prices, right, of the elective surgeries are much higher, in fact, the spending going through the hospital system is lower. So that looks like a kind of recession in that sector. So a lot of the services decline is actually from healthcare. But you can go ahead and set it up, but I just wanted to point that out first.
So, I mean, I am in desperate need of a haircut, and my barber, who I had been with for probably 3 or 4 years, has closed his shop.
I see. Sorry to hear that.
I am too, and it's really, really sad. And this is far from unique. A lot of friends that I have are creatives and also work in the service industry, and they're hurting. And I think fair to say that a majority of my peer group and my friend group are in pretty precarious economic situations, caught between lack of work and May 1st is come and gone for rent. So can you explain what makes this recession or potentially impending depression different as far as services goes?
Yeah, so usually the service sector is kind of a stabilizing force. So you have different sectors of the economy. Traditionally I had always taught my students that services are basically acyclical, so you don't really see much change in that sector. You see things like consumer durables, things like refrigerators. People cut back on that. That really falls off a cliff. And things like investment. And I think actually investment is the kind of big shoe to drop, that even if consumption doesn't fall that much, investment is just going to plunge, because everybody has excess capacity. You don't need to add new buildings or new equipment or anything like that outside of a few sectors. Maybe Amazon is maybe trying to build some new warehouses, but outside of that, nobody's going to be adding new airplanes in the airline sector anytime soon. Most businesses have excess capacity, and so I expect investment still to just plunge. So if you look actually in the Great Recession in terms of services, which is a huge share of our economy, it's kind of going up over time. In the peak to trough, the peak is December 2007 when the economy is kind of at its peak, and then the trough in June 2009 is when it's kind of at the bottom point. From there, actually you see about flat services demand. So the service sector, in terms of how much people are spending on it, is about the same, even adjusting for inflation. It actually went up a little bit, 0.1%. But that shows you just how stabilizing the service sector is. And so it's also a good thing, because there's a lot of jobs in the service sector. So it's very labor intensive, just because you're kind of dealing with human beings. And so you just have a lot more workers in the restaurant sector than you do in the auto sector. So I guess this is a couple months old. My piece is not brand new, but as of a couple months ago, if you look at, say, employment in the auto parts sector, how many employees they had, including assembly and parts and everything, it's about 1 million. And then in other sectors like retail is something like 5 or 6 million. Restaurants I think is 8, something like that. You just have hospitality, tourism. All of these have just millions of workers. So we kind of focus on these older manufacturing industries, but there's actually not a lot of employment there, and they tend to have more kind of union protection. So unionization is higher there, so it kind of delays the job losses. Whereas in the service sector, you have lots of employees. They tend to be lower paid, and they don't have these union protections in general in most of these industries. And so you're just seeing a torrent of job losses. And so that prediction kind of panned out. That there's just a lot more workers in these sectors. There's very few protections for them, and so then these sectors have just shed jobs. If you look at things like hotels, more than half of people in some places, 90 or 100% of employees have been laid off.
Jesus Christ.
So you're just seeing a big difference in the service sector, where usually a lot of those employees don't see a lot of job losses. So in restaurants, in the last recession, you see maybe 5% decline in jobs. So it's just not very big, and so most recessions don't focus on the service sector, because you generally have to buy services to consume them. So if you want to get a haircut, there's no inventory of haircuts in the back, and so you've got to get a haircut. So it's not like an old car where you can continue to drive it, so that auto sales really fall significantly in a recession. So this is going to first hit the services sector, just because it's human oriented, and so then it's not a good sector to be in a pandemic. So people are going to stop doing services, and then we're going to get a kind of second wave where then as incomes fall, then people are going to stop buying cars. There may be fewer house purchases and things like that.
It's stunning to me. I mean, does the unique nature of that make this have the potential to be worse than the Great Depression?
Well, the job losses are certainly happening much faster. So I think it's kind of an interplay between that. The optimists are saying, well, all these are temporary furloughs, but a lot of restaurants are going to close. The other thing is that services don't have inventories. So businesses kind of want to forecast the turning points. It's good to know when the economy's turning down, when you're at the peak, because then you can kind of cut back on investment. You don't want to be over-invested, make a big investment decision right before a downturn, because then you're not going to have a lot of cash. And so you see that even in sectors that are booming, like Google is cutting back on investment, even though they're doing fine generally, just to kind of conserve their cash in case there's problems down the road. And then you also want to kind of forecast the bottom, though, the trough, because you want to be able to ramp up production as your customers come back. So if you have an auto dealership, you've got cars on the lot that you can sell later. And so then when you see the customers coming in, you can phone up Toyota and say, we've got more orders for cars, and then Toyota will start ramping up, call back the workers and run more shifts and things like that. But if your barber is shut down, right, and maybe he would have been okay if he had known what things will look like in a month or two,
right?
But he's not going to know, how many people are coming back. Same thing with restaurants. They may just not know how many people are going to come back to their restaurant versus others, and so then you won't get that signal to kind of restart production and services. So I think that that gives economists don't really have a good playbook, since this recession will be so different, since there will be significant hit to services, and that'll continue as long as the disease is out there. I mean, I'm not going to restaurants as much, not flying, not staying in hotels. So, that's really, that's gonna persist. And so you might have a bounce back in hotels from them filling, 5 or 10% of rooms to filling half. But, a lot of hotels just can't operate at those levels.
Right.
And so even if you get a big bounce back, a lot of them will still go bankrupt. And so for now, they're hanging on because of this CARES Act, because the assumption is that it's going to be temporary. But a lot of these sectors are going to be hit permanently, and so we may see another wave once this stimulus package runs out. A lot of then it's kind of the Wile E. Coyote moment where we ran out over the cliff, and then people are going to look down and see how bad things are going to be in the fall. I mean, we're kind of seeing that in the last week, that people are revising downward how rapidly the recovery will be. But I think in the late summer, early fall, we'll see a bigger readjustment.
It's a long time.
Yeah,
it's a long time. I suppose one thing I wanted to ask you about, which I know very little about, but I've been trying to do a little bit of cursory research because I hear it being talked about a bit more frequently, is MMT, modern monetary theory. Is that something you might be able to expound about?
Yes, well, I'm not, I wouldn't call myself an MMT adherent, but, I think that they've done well because of how ridiculous the kind of austerity and the debt, the people that are hysterical about the debt have been. And so to some extent, I think they've really made MMT of the movement that it is, because, their predictions are tending to pan out when they say, the interest rates won't rise. We don't need to worry about the debt. We need to worry about, kind of real factors, unemployment or bottlenecks or things like that. And so I think that, that'll only continue as there'll be more and more hysteria about the debt. The people that are being so hysterical are going to continue to be wrong, and MMT's predictions will continue to pan out that interest rates will stay low, that we won't face a debt crisis. And so I expect that they'll continue to do well, especially now that, AOC is going to participate in the government. So, MMT's kind of rising from it. It was only created really, or only kind of formulated in the 90s. So it's had a very rapid ascent. And, in a lot of places you wouldn't expect, in the financial world, on financial Twitter, you can see a lot of adherence. Can
you give a brief primer, a brief explanation of its core principles?
I don't know if I am the best person, and it's kind of hard to encapsulate in a single a single clip. It would take an hour or two, I think. And like I said, I'm not an adherent, so I'm perhaps not the best person to talk about it. But
fair.
Essentially, I think that they're saying we want to think about the Fed and the Treasury as kind of working together. That you can create money or you can create debt, so the government can fund itself in different ways. Though they have a different view that they view that money is created when it's spent, I believe, not when you collect taxes or issue debt. So that's a bit different than the way I think about the world. But ultimately, you want to think about a kind of the two pieces of the government working together. That the Fed and the Treasury are both two ways to take money out of the economy, kind of cool down the economy. You can create less money, or you can issue debt to kind of drain money out of the system. And so then but the main lesson, I think, is that you want to think about kind of real factors. So you might get inflation if the economy is overheating, or if you get those kind of cost shocks like from oil. We might get some cost shocks from food, but overall I think that won't be dominant. But you kind of want to think about real factors and not just think about kind of how much money is out there. So you want to think about is the government spending too much and kind of overheating the economy, or are you getting these cost shocks, rather than just thinking about the Fed is creating X trillion dollars. And so we're seeing that today, that their prediction that creating X $3 trillion is not a problem. Actually, I don't know exactly how much so I guess the Fed is more like $1 trillion, but
yeah.
You don't just want to think about how much the Fed is, how many trillions the Fed is creating. You want to think about kind of real factors in the economy. How much is being spent? Is that causing companies to raise their prices faster? Rather than just thinking about a certain number of trillions on the debt or the money supply. And I think that overall that's going to be a better guide than the kind of mainstream thinking about just hysteria about the debt is X trillion. That's not really going to be a useful way to think about the world.
It's some certainly unprecedented times. I to be honest, I'm struggling to find some optimism in it, and maybe that's just because I am a debt holder and I have a net worth of significantly less than zero.
Yeah,
and I'd imagine that a lot of the $1,200 Trump bucks stimulus checks just ended up going off to pay off debt rather than to help.
We are seeing some of that, definitely.
Yeah, help to improve your life. I don't have any other particular topics to discuss with you. Is there any parting thoughts that you would like to bring up to our listeners?
Well, we could talk about the debt and things like that. I mean,
please.
I think overall, again, looking back at the 90s, comparing the discussions in the Democratic Party, there have been, people putting in proposals to have debt relief in some of these stimulus packages. They continue to be taken out, but the amount of space for policy proposals that we've seen recently, having a Democratic debate on, I think, CNN, where they discussed job guarantees. They discussed, things related to MMT, I believe, Green New Deal and things like that. So there has been a lot of progress in terms of moving the Overton window, where, in the 90s, people didn't want to be called liberals. That was considered a kind of leftist. There was many conservative Democrats. Yeah, I mean, that's really
so
changed a lot.
Me.
The conservatives still say that. They talk about owning the libs, but leftists now say that too. So that
confirm.
Was considered, that was considered kind of far left to be a liberal. You wanted to be a moderate or a conservative back then, and so none of these, everybody was just talking about non-refundable tax credits and things like that. So I think that the kind of policy discussion has opened up a lot. Bernie Sanders doing so well electorally, would have in the 90s he would have got a few percent, I think. I think that that has opened up a lot. There haven't been kind of tangible victories, but I'm kind of more optimistic about policy potentially moving in the right direction. Thinking about the Great Depression, you have a kind of wave election. in 32, and FDR starts as relatively moderate. He runs on opposing Hoover's deficits. And his first act is a kind of austerity act to lower government salaries. So, there is potential for things to improve. I think that Congress is kind of underrated for FDR, that they kind of move him left and kind of push him to do more radical things, because he starts as a kind of moderate to conservative Democrat. Yep. But the Times kind of moved things in a forward direction. So in 2008 we also got a wave election. It wasn't great, but we did get some stimulus packages, and Obamacare I think is on net better than what we had before. Hopefully this can continue this process. Hopefully we get a wave election, and there can be real progress in 2021. So personally, this is not financial advice, but I think that stock market will recover in 2021 if we can get a wave election and a big stimulus package, if we have hopefully 60 Democrats in the Senate and a bigger majority in the House.
It's the one thing that really just strikes me, especially kind of listening to this conversation, is the reliance of private industry on government.
Yes.
And the how much, despite the fact that conservatives and liberals, for that matter, talk about how government intervention is bad for business, it seems like if not for government intervention, capitalist businesses would be fucked.
Yeah, so this, one essay that I think is interesting about these points are relevant is Koletsky. He's a kind of leftist economist in the mid-20th century. So he wrote about the kind of political economy of recessions. So you might think it's puzzling, why, since business will suffer in a recession, why do they oppose government action? And so he argued that, it's a kind of labor disciplining device. So during a boom, workers can ask for higher wages because there's not really high unemployment. And so even though the businesses will suffer, it's kind of disciplining device, because then you have this kind of reserve army of the unemployed, and then wages will go down. Workers will be, have to kind of beg for their jobs again. And so the business sector, is willing to accept a recession for that reason. And also they don't want, they want to be the kind of lifeblood of the economy. So they want the view to be that you need these entrepreneurs to create jobs. And so if the government can just do these stimulus programs, they can just create money or spend money, then it's clear that the entrepreneurs are not essential, that business is not essential, that the government can kind of adjust the levers and create a recovery. And so then they don't want to have that either for ideological reasons. And so I think that that's part of the kind of cognitive dissonance. I think some businesses are kind of ideological and they are opposed to government intervention on principle. Some are this kind of Koletskian model where they want to have labor disciplining, that they're willing to accept it because now they've got lots of job applicants, and the shoe is on the other foot. Whereas we did see some kind of green shoots of wage increases right before the recession hit. And then I think you have some businesses that are purely profit maximizing, that support government intervention to kind of help the economy recover.
Wild. I want to be I want to be respectful of your time. I think we've done
I think we're about an hour, so I think we talked about an hour to an hour and a half. So
yeah, no, it's a pretty solid amount of content.
Yeah.
Gabe, I'm super pleased that you were interested in coming on the show. I think this was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure it was fascinating for the listener, as it was for me. I think if we had to ask the question, is money real? Not convinced. Not convinced.
Yeah, so
real.
I think that touches on something else. It's related to the Koletsky, but you realize how the government is in the background, right? I mean, if you look at things like private property, ultimately that's enforced by the government. So Mill talked about J.S. Mill talked about this kind of night watchman state, because he was a kind of classical liberal. So he said you should have a government that just enforces property rights, that just has the police, because ultimately you can think about evictions. Right, it's not the mortgage company that evicts you; it's the sheriff, right? So ultimately, you've got the government in the background, and so I think the libertarian perspective is, well, that kind of basic function is just normal or natural, kind of the Millian perspective, and the government interventions to have stimulus are kind of unnatural or extraordinary. But ultimately, the government sets the rules of the game. They're going to have different policies to structure how the economy works. And so it's no more unnatural to have the Fed create $3 trillion more as to create $3 trillion less. of money. So, ultimately, those are kind of arbitrary distinctions. I mean, it's like, some libertarians say we don't want to have regulation, but, they're fine with saying prosecuting companies for fraud because they say that's just a normal law. But, ultimately the regulation is kind of how much disclosure do you have. So ultimately there's no, real hard line between saying fraud is at this level and you need to disclose Y versus saying fraud is at this level and you need to disclose Z. So ultimately I think, the crises also kind of expose how the government is behind the scenes, kind of in Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Yep.
Because ultimately the government is involved in at least setting the rules and setting the kind of broad macro policies that really are important for a lot of the functioning of the economy. So, the economic structure, the kind of private sector is important, but the government's playing a role in a lot of these aspects. And so, it can arbitrarily just change the amount of money out there. And so people are kind of realizing that, I think, in this time.
Well, I think it goes without saying that for us, at least in our worldview, how important it is for the workers not only to own the economy, but also, be in the seat of power in government, because when we have the ruling class that has taken the seat of power and has ownership of many of the private interests that are represented in government, they tend to create solutions that help themselves more than they help workers.
But that brings us to something I wanted to talk about, which is one proposal to structure how to respond to, businesses being shut and, businesses struggling in this crisis is think about a model from Argentina where in their economic crisis in the early 2000s, sometimes business, the owners just left and then the workers were running the companies. So there's a famous hotel in Buenos Aires, I think it's Hotel Bauer or Bowen, but the workers basically took it over and kept running it, and then the owner tried to come back later, but the workers continued to run it as a worker co-op. So Amazing. Another option would have been, rather than having all these loans and giveaways to business, to just say, well, you tried, you went bankrupt, so why don't we try a different structure and have worker-owned companies instead? So this wasn't really discussed yet. The policy, the Overton window hasn't shifted that much, but that would have been an alternate model, and that's something I think we could think about. United was nominally owned by its workers for a while. The workers didn't seem to, or at least the union didn't want to continue that structure. But that would be that was one missed opportunity, I think, in the crisis, was to think more about using this to transition the economy to be more worker-owned and operated. And so there, I think it would have been more robust in the face of this crisis, because then instead of having the employer trying to force the employee to work in unsafe situations, then the workers would decide for themselves, at what level do you want to produce, what's the safe level, and so you would avoid all these kind of bargaining issues. And so unfortunately we didn't really see much of that in the crisis, but that I think would have been one opening that would have saved the, if you're really worried about the deficit, then you just let the businesses go bankrupt and let the workers run the companies out of bankruptcy.
For the listener, I am throwing my hands up in the air and punching the air because that's exactly the idea. Yeah. It's such a fucking no-brainer.
So I think we missed the boat on that. But, the PPP is very expensive, and so that would have been an option. You just say, you've got this company, some of them will go bankrupt, and then we can, use that to just have workers run the company rather than the former owners.
Yep. Gabe, what a pleasure having you on the show. I really, really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks. I had a great time. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. And I hope to have you on again soon, because I have a feeling that this isn't going to be a static situation, and this is going to continue to change.
There will be more.
Yes, it will. So again, thank you very much for coming on Eat the Rich. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it.
All right, stay cool, everybody.
Way you do it. You play the guitar on the